thank you very much for coming. I hope you can hear me. My voice is really low. It's a real pleasure to have Matt Bluemink today with us. I'm really excited that he accepted the invitation to be part of the public program of our exhibition, which is called Processing Process. And it's based on the postdoctoral research that I've been doing the last few years. And it came into being in collaboration with the Astro team and Aisa and City and our other colleagues that are not here. They are based in Berlin and Athens. And today Matt is going to talk about foam cities and Sloterdijk.
Yeah.
Dutch name, difficult to pronounce. I've known Matt's work for a while now. He has influenced a lot my thinking, and I've seen his work in my doctoral research and my postdoc, so it's quite a very surreal experience to sit with Matt here and to have this hopefully really exciting talk. Like, I'm really looking forward to it. Matt has written on theory of individuation. This is how I got to know his work. He's interested in the philosophical and political implications of techniques, and especially he works around the work of Deleuze and Stigler and Simondon. That is our common point there. And he has an upcoming book that's going to be published by Becoming Books. It's a Berlin-based publishing house, and it's called The Future Is Not Lost. It's coming out in 2026.
Yeah, hopefully it should be out by around May. Not a publication date confirmed yet, but it should be done by May.
Great, so I'll give the floor to you then.
Thanks so much, Korina, for this introduction. And yeah, so I wanted to just give a little bit of background today about why I chose to talk about Sloterdijk and why I chose to talk about foam cities in general. Can you next one? Thank you. So, Sloterdijk's an interesting character. Let me just try and preface it by saying that. He's not your kind of traditional philosopher. He does kind of somewhat fit into this idea of process philosophy that Korina's very interested in, and we have some shared interest there. But his main kind of concern is more about space and about the living environment that humans actually are part of. So that takes lots of different forms in terms of technology, in terms of architecture, in terms of just atmosphere and climate as well. But he's a little bit of a philosophical rebel. He studied a lot in India in the 70s. He went over and was studying kind of more esoteric Eastern philosophy in the 70s. Came back, was very into basically in the kind of critical theory school in Germany. He was kind of working within that framework, but also pushing against it at the time, and had some quite high-profile disagreements with other famous philosophers in Germany because of that. So I'm going to be talking mostly about his work, the Spheres trilogy, and how that pertains to this idea of process philosophy. Spheres trilogy for Sloterdijk is basically his magnum opus. It's a gigantic book. It's basically three big books that are around just under 1,000 pages each. And so I'm going to go into that a little bit today. In the foam section, which is the third one of the trilogy, he has a really kind of wide variety of different influences and different things that he talks about. So there's a point in there where he'll be talking about the philosophy of greenhouses, for example, and then he'll move on to psychedelic capitalism, and then there's a bit in there where he talks about the philosophy of breakfast. So I mean, it's we're getting things from all over the place here, but the main focus of the talk is going to be looking at cities and how this idea of spheres and foams in particular can be applied to things like architecture and things about how cities can adapt to climate change moving forward. So also for those of you who might be aware of thinkers like Bruno Latour or Deleuze and Guattari, one of Sloterdijk's main conceptions in terms of looking at things in terms of spheres is, if you imagine, for example, a network like you might have in active network theory for Latour or the rhizome in Deleuze and Guattari, lots of different points on a network connected by lines or by various different whatever the connecting substance might be. If you imagine those points connected, what Sloterdijk really wants to do is add a dimension of space to these points on the network. So rather than having a point here and a point here, we're essentially making that 3D. We're trying to take this out and make it into a sphere, and then if you expand the spheres, when they come into contact with each other, this is where we get to this idea of foams. So I'll go into this a little bit now, but that's sort of just trying to give you a little bit of a preface on it. So, this is a quote from Bruno Latour from 2005, a big fan of Sloterdijk's, and an important thinker in his own right as well. This is Sloterdijk's explicitness. You're on life support. It's fragile, it's technical, it's public, it's political. It can break down, it is breaking down, it's being fixed. You're not too confident of those who fix it. Our current condition merely relies on a more explicit understanding that this tentative technological system, this life support, entails the whole planet, even its atmosphere. So I wanted to begin with this quote because I think it captures something that some of us feel intuitively, even if we don't really kind of articulate it. So it's the idea that we're living in these kind of these kind of overarching systems that sustain us. They're systems that we didn't design individually. They might be technical, they might be environmental, but nonetheless we depend on them collectively. So bearing that in mind, thinking of new conceptual solutions to the climate crisis is one of the most pressing issues facing philosophers and other thinkers in the 21st century. As the world population continues to congregate into cities, more and more people are faced with the prospect of rising sea levels, extreme weather conditions, and high temperatures brought around by global warming. Indeed, to understand how cities can adapt to these changes, we're immediately presented with the question of what cities are. And to answer these questions requires a new kind of thinking, one that can conceptualize our current predicament on a variety of different levels. So in this talk, I want to talk about the work of Peter Sloterdijk as a philosopher who places vital importance on the coexistent nature of the human, both in relation to the urban environment and to the atmospheric conditions created by it. I'll lay out how Sloterdijk's concepts of foams and atmospheres serve as the ideal tool for philosophers, artists, or social scientists to discuss the implications of climate change, among many other things, from a brand new perspective. Next slide, please. So again, going back to the Spheres trilogy, again, like almost 3,000 pages of text there. I'm going to try and summarize it in about 3 paragraphs. So in his Spheres trilogy, Sloterdijk provides us with an analysis of what he sees as a morphological transition in the history of human thought. He develops both a historically informed theory that details a shift in how humans understand the world, and a theory of space which is concerned with the particular spheres they inhabit. The Spheres trilogy takes influence from a huge variety of different sources, from philosophers Heidegger, Benjamin, and Deleuze, to sociologists Gabriel Tarde, architect Le Corbusier, and biologist Friedrich von Erskine, among many others. It's from von Erskine's cybernetic studies on the different scales of human life, different scales of life in the 1920s, where Sloterdijk takes his initial idea of understanding the world through bubbles. Von Erskine claimed, quote, "It was an error to believe that the human world constituted a shared stage for all living creatures. Each living creature has its own special stage that is just as real as the special stage that humans have. This insight offers a completely new view of the universe as something that does not consist of a single soap bubble, which we have blown up so large as to go well beyond the horizons, our horizons, and assume infinite proportions, and is instead made up of millions of closely demarcated soap bubbles that overlap and intersect everywhere." So we'll see how this idea from Tarde expands in Sloterdijk's theorizing of it. So in the first book of the series, Bubbles, 2011, Sloterdijk gives us a conception of what he calls microspheres, which is based on the idea, following von Erskine, that bubbles can be seen as an accurate metaphor for the basic structure of human interaction. Bubbles represent an inherent relationality in human nature, a co-subjectivity which suggests the creation of an enclosed spatial interior that is never disconnected from what exists outside of it. So imagine soap bubbles connecting together, the spatial interior is inside the bubble, etc. This idea of coexistence moves us away from the individuality of being towards a dual primacy of being with. As Sloterdijk says himself, one could certainly read Spheres 1 as a dive into the abyss of ontological nervousness for the coexistent, the other, the outer. So what Sloterdijk is essentially trying to do here is overturn like a long-held philosophical tendency to think of the individual as a self-contained starting point. Instead, connectivity, and this kind of links into the ideas of the exhibition as well, connectivity to others, to space, to shared interiors is already there at the beginning of the philosophical project. The second book, Globes, from 2014, moves on to the historical examination of thought in relation to macrospheres. So we have the microspheres, bubbles, and globes becomes macrosphere. which extend the spherical metaphor from the realm of metaphysics and theology to contemporary globalization. Bruno Latour claims that for Sloterdijk, the complete singularity of Western philosophy, science and theology, and politics lies in the fact that we have infused all the virtues into the figure of a globe with a capital G, without paying slightest attention to the way in which that globe might be built, tended, maintained, or inhabited. Once again, we see Sloterdijk's concern with the processual nature of creating our living environment, and the importance this has of reconceptualizing humanity through spatiality. The historical notion of the globe as an expanded, all-encompassing sphere of existence has been brought into question by the constantly shifting nature of the modern milieu we're a part of. So he's basically saying, up until a certain point in human history, the idea of the globe was an all-encompassing idea. He links it to lots of different things in religion, etc. But he says, moving into the third section of the spheres trilogy, into foams, we're moving into a world where the globe is no longer a sufficient way of looking at things. We need to look at things in terms of lots of spheres joined together, i.e. a foam. So this sphere concept is further explored in the book, the final book of this series, Foams, from 2016, where Sloterdijk diagnoses the spatial relationships between the human and its technological world through an analysis of architecture, urban planning, and environment. His claim is that due to the increasing level of global interconnectivity and the rapidly rising population, we have shifted into an epoch in which all human actions are determined and potentially limited by their proximity to other humans. To exemplify this point, Sloterdijk uses the metaphor of a foam as it signifies a structure comprised of a number of chambers or cells, like bubbles, that are separated from each other by thin, fragile, and easily collapsible walls. What this implies is that our individual microspheres are in a constant state of codependence and co-fragility with one another. Each individual sphere of existence is inherently related to and defined by its relation to others. Next slide. So here I wanted to just take a quick break and get everyone to kind of conceptualize themselves and the worlds that they live in terms of spheres, in terms of bubbles. This was, I thought, a really good picture that kind of exemplified what he's talking about there. So if you imagine each individual in the audience has a particular sphere that's connected to a person near them. We have 1, 2, 3 there. You can imagine how they would expand out in that picture there. All our combined spheres make up a foam where we can look at our actions collectively from the foam perspective or individually from the bubble perspective. The foam we're a part of is also maintained by an atmosphere, so that this room has an atmosphere, there might be air conditioning in here, it's different temperature to outside, and this separates it from all of the atmospheres outside, whether it be the city, whether it be the countryside, etc. And so just thinking about everybody in terms of bubbles and your own spatial interior that you inhabit as a person will be useful when we're talking about the other things moving forward. So, when considering things such as sustainable development and climate change adaptation in urban environments, the importance of the foam metaphor becomes increasingly clear, especially in the latter half of the book where Sloterdijk makes explicit references to foam architectures and foam cities. Here he analyses the recent history of architecture and cities as an example of our transition into a foam-like mode of being, on both the macro and micro scales. He writes that the true spatial revolution of the 20th century is the explication of the human sojourn or residence in an interior via the dwelling machine, climate design, and environmental planning. And he doesn't just mean climate and environmental in the kind of ecological sense. He's talking about that in a more substantialist sense of thinking about climate in general. What does the air mean for how humans live? What does the environment mean for how we can survive? This is the kind of main thing that he's actually concerned with here. Foams therefore can be seen as a perfect conceptual tool with which to analyse how city architecture brings about changes in climate that affect our being as humans within an interconnected environment. Next slide, please. So the next section I wanted to go on to is atmo-spheres. So you might notice the pun there of atmospheres. Throughout the whole work, he has a lot of different puns. So atmospheres become different kinds of spheres, for example. There'll be a few other things which you'll see in there as well. But the point is that an atmosphere itself is basically a different kind of sphere that we inhabit as humans, and it's fundamentally important to what he's talking about here. So, furthermore, Sloterdijk's concern in foams is also explicitly atmospheric. He claims that the spatial revolution that has been expurgated throughout the 20th century with the increasing awareness of atmosphere conditions brought about by a variety of factors, from the atmo-terrorist use of gas warfare in the First World War to the wide implementation of air conditioning systems which create a multiplicity of microclimates within modern buildings. Even in the creation of greenhouses in Victorian England, hence the picture, we can see the first evidence of human societies being explicitly concerned with controlling and creating the atmospheric nature of their environment. As he states, greenhouses of this kind are not just any 19th century building type, they constitute the most important architectural innovation since antiquity. For with them, the construction of houses becomes an explicit act of climate construction. So this is kind of a really interesting point, a little bit of a subversive point, I think, but it's something that when I first read it, it kind of really clicked for me. Can you go to the next slide, please? So even the whole idea of creating a greenhouse is essentially, even from a colonial perspective, you're essentially taking the climate and the environment from a different land and importing it into your own land in a micro sort of realm. So, you know, there are lots of different things that could come from that. We grow different types of food. We can interact in loads of different kinds of ways due to being able to create different climates within the climates that we exist in. This was something that was much more difficult before the Victorian era. Obviously, you know, within dwellings themselves, there might be slight variations in terms of climate, but being able to specifically change the heat and the different humidity and things like that in greenhouses was a big milestone. What Sloterdijk says was a big milestone in the way humans treat climate. He talks a lot about also, this is the Crystal Palace, the original Crystal Palace that was built in the 19th century. The biggest enclosed interior in the whole of human history when it was originally built. Something like, I think you could fit St. Peter's Basilica 4 times inside it when it was originally built. It was absolutely gigantic. And also within there, it also had its own microclimate as well. So interestingly, I always thought for a glass building, Crystal Palace actually burnt down. I always kind of thought that was surprising. You wouldn't imagine a building made of glass and metal to actually be able to burn down, but it did. Next slide, please. And then here we have the sort of modern, maybe the most modern and most obviously bubble or foam-like building that there is in the world. Another type of greenhouse, which is the Eden Project down in Cornwall, I believe, which is basically a giant greenhouse for different types of tropical plants, etc. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So here, just like with foams, he uses the idea of atmosphere both literally and metaphorically to denote the change in relation to the subject and the world around it. He summarizes this by claiming the theme of the cultural sciences in the transition from the 20th century to the 21st century is therefore making air conditions explicit. And this is why I put this picture of First World War gas masks as well, because he talks quite a lot about this idea of atmo-terrorism in the First World War following the greenhouses, was basically a very important point in this whole idea of climate design, because it was the first time where the environment and the air around us had actually been used as a way to harm us, so he says. So when you're talking about making the air itself explicit as something that keeps you alive normally, you know, it's our kind of life condition essentially. For the first time ever, humans have basically become aware that this was something that could be changed. So what this means is that we've come into a time in which air itself has developed a different kind of significance. Our increasing awareness of the air conditions in which we live forces us to understand that our atmosphere acts as our own life support system, something fragile, technical, and shared. Atmo-spheres therefore become understood as one of the ontological spheres, so the spheres of being, in which humanity exists, and through which microspheres are connected. The implications of this way of thinking are extremely wide-ranging, but if Sloterdijk is to be followed precisely, his thinking breaks down the binary distinctions between nature and society and attaches the notion of agency to both the human and non-human worlds. So again, think the plants in the greenhouse might have some kind of agency in terms of the way that they're developed there. Latour claims that overcoming this divide is a priority that he shares with Sloterdijk. Spheres and networks, quote, he says, have both been elaborated against the same sort of enemy, an ancient and constantly deeper apparent divide between nature and society. So to think in those terms immediately forces us to understand atmosphere beyond what would have previously been considered either natural or social. Next slide, please. So now I wanted to go specifically onto this idea of foam architecture and how he talked about how this idea of foams being multiple different spheres of existence can actually be understood architecturally, basically. So, to analyse specifically how climate and atmosphere can be understood in modern city context, Sloterdijk spends a lot of time analysing the tendency of modern human dwellings to form densely stacked apartment buildings. At the beginning of this discussion on foam architecture, Sloterdijk writes that, quote, "Anyone who studies the history of recent architecture in its connection to a mediatized society's form of life will immediately recognize that the two most successful architectural innovations of the 20th century, the apartment and the sports stadium, are directly related to the most widespread sociological tendencies in the period, i.e. the creation of solitary dwellers via individualizing housing and media techniques, and the concentration of uniformly aroused masses via organized events in large-scale fashionogenic edifices." So for the purpose of this talk, I'm not really going to go into the analysis of stadiums, but his conception of the apartment, I think, is central to his understanding of foam cities in general. And I think this picture there is a capsule, I can't remember the exact name of it, but a capsule building, capsule apartment block in Tokyo, which recently got developed, I think, demolished in 2022. But each of those individual cubes that you can see is its own capsule, its own living space. So it fits quite well into that kind of bubble interior idea. So Sloterdijk defines the modern apartment building as, quote, "a nuclear or elementary egospheric form, and consequently as the cellular world bubble whose mass repetition produces individualistic foams." He sees that in apartments, especially single studio apartments, the individual living space is reduced to its most basic form, in which the individual becomes the solitary inhabitant as a cellular core of his private world bubble. Each individual is therefore isolated from, yet connected to, the surrounding inhabitants in a foam. Apartment blocks lack the atmospheric separation of detached housing, and this co-isolation makes their foamy structure particularly visible. As Christian Borch summarizes, whether it appears in multi-unit high-rise buildings or in smaller low-rise structures, the apartment block is foam architecture par excellence. Next slide, please. Furthermore, if global warming increases as projected, it will be necessary for cities to reduce their overall energy consumption. And one effective method of doing this is by implementing something like a green belt around the city, which serves as a cut-off point that defines the city's limits and essentially limits urban sprawl. The green belt has been found to force compactness in city design, increasing the dependence on foam-like architecture, such as tall apartment blocks and things like that, as a necessary method for adapting to constantly rising population. However, this idea potentially leads to one of the key issues in contemporary urban planning, the phenomenon of urban heat islands. So urban heat islands are created when a particular urban area develops significantly higher temperatures than the surrounding regions. They are dangerous because they intensify heat waves by trapping heat at the level of the dwelling, often leading to increased mortality rates. And this can be not just within like a particular city. So there, for example, you have the whole city as a heat island in and of itself, but it can be different parts of the city, potentially like parts that are particularly more built up or densely packed compared to like more rural or greener, usually richer parts of the city, for example. So in limiting the sprawl of the city via greenbelt, the increasing reliance on foam architecture could potentially lead to a dangerous increase in the urban heat island effect. So the understanding of islands, so taking this island idea more philosophically, the understanding of islands that create their own climate is something explicitly focused on by Sloterdijk. This is another point where his architectural and philosophical analyses converge. He uses the island analogy to emphasize how a particular environment can serve as a model for the world, whilst also being disconnected from it. The enclosure of a city through a greenbelt, together with the emergence of a distinct local climate produced by urban heat islands, makes clear the importance of thinking in island terms. Next slide, please. But the island is never completely cut off. It's always in relation to what surrounds it. For this reason, it is not a single bubble, but a foam. As Sloterdijk writes, the theory of islands can be used to show how ensouled inner worlds become possible, and how multiplicities of analogous worlds join to form archipelagos or aquatic rhizomes. The city can therefore be understood as a climate island, a sphere with its own atmospheric conditions, continually shaped and modified at its outer limits, such as the greenbelt. In Sloterdijkian terms, the greenbelt therefore acts as the island's sea, a framing boundary that encloses the city, increases density, and encourages the spread of cellular architectural forms, such as apartment blocks. Now, the island's limit is always permeable. It can always be moved and adapted based on changes in its atmospheric conditions, which in this case could be something like heat or pollution, etc. If we're to take Sloterdijk's conclusion seriously, we must emphasize relationality and adaptability over fixity. And from this perspective, A spherological understanding of the city points to a new phase in architecture and urban planning. This phase will highlight the importance of an architecture which is not just a physical membrane, but is open to some degree of modification or adaptation, according to what takes place outside of the membrane. This is one of the key lessons we can learn from Sloterdijk's analysis. The conceptualization of a city as an island with permeable borders and the nature of the foam architecture within it shows us that any urban environment to prosper in an unpredictable future, it will become increasingly adaptable to its atmospheric conditions. Next slide, please. So again, I wanted to kind of take it back a little bit to this idea of thinking about everything in terms of bubbles, and thinking about ourselves, our living environments in terms of bubbles, in terms of foams. So imagine that we're all individual bubbles. Our living spaces are individual bubbles. Our houses and apartment blocks are foams of interconnected bubbles. The city understood collectively is a foam city of many individual bubbles. This can be understood in terms of the different microclimates of different buildings that create a citywide macroclimate or an atmosphere. But the foam city exists as its own climate island. It's separated from the surrounding areas, not just in terms of climate, but perhaps also politically as well. So for example, I mean now, it's quite evident that at least across the Western world, one of the biggest political divides now is between rural and urban areas. It's like if you'll see, even thinking about this idea of islands, if you look at a voting map from the last couple of elections in the UK or in the US, and I'm sure across Europe as well, but particularly in the UK, you'll see little islands of red in a sea of blue. That's usually the way that it works. Different voting intentions, different political ideas coming from different lived environments, essentially. So the islands also take place in that regard as well. But yeah, essentially, the foam city can be looked at as a 3D network that exists within its own atmosphere. So imagining that idea of the network, again, connecting all these things together, but adding that dimension of space to it. Next slide, please. So the final section I want to talk about is on polluted atmospheres. So if Sloterdijk is right, and our atmo-spheres are one of the key spheres of existence, what does it mean for our atmospheres to be polluted? And what does this reveal about our relationship to the world outside of us? In his essay accompanying the artist Olafur Eliasson's 2003 weather project at the Tate Modern, Bruno Latour argued that the increasing awareness of our atmosphere through climate modelling has shown how scientific experiments, once the domain of the laboratory, have been extended to encompass the whole world. In the age of the Anthropocene, we are constantly conducting a worldwide experiment on the atmosphere of our planet, the effects of which can be felt in real time. And cities only intensify this experiment, as geographer Stephen Graham writes. The extra high concentration of greenhouse gases and other pollutants that linger above cities, and the tendency of concrete and asphalt to heavily absorb the sun's heat, means that cities are systematically filled with complex cocktails of pollutants. Even today, due to the increasing rates of industrialization, the World Health Organization has stated that 7.6% of all human deaths can be related to atmospheric air pollution. Therefore, the expansion of the laboratory to a global scale presents a significant problem. The problem is, Latour writes, while we believe we know how to conduct a scientific experiment in the narrow confines of the laboratory, we have no idea how to pursue the collective experiments in the confusing atmosphere of a whole culture. In other words, for cities to see the necessity of climate adaptation, the consequences of our vast atmospheric experiment must be made explicit to them. And I believe that Sloterdijk's theories of foam, spheres, and atmospheres are a perfect conceptual tool to help with that task. So to sum up, Latour brings us back to Sloterdijk's criticism of the Heideggerian question of being. He states that Peter asks his master Heidegger the rather mischievous question, when you say Dasein is thrown into the world, where is it thrown? For Sloterdijk, we cannot understand the human as existing separately from the other beings or life support systems that allow it to exist in the first place. Nor can we understand the individual beings as having a distinct nature or culture independent of the networks of relations of which they are embedded. It is only through Sloterdijk's spatial analysis that we can truly understand the relationship between city and atmosphere. City spheres cannot make the adaptive changes demanded by global warming until they are confronted with phenomena such as urban heat islands and air pollution in ways that make the atmosphere itself visible and explicit. Air pollution and other climatic effects therefore take on a new significance that is at once ontological and environmental. They enable a spherological interpretation of the city as a foam that reconceptualizes atmosphere as an atmosphere. An atmosphere can no longer be reduced to the air that we breathe. Instead, it must be a sphere of existence that functions as a life support system containing a multiplicity of elements of which particulate matter is only one. So understanding the relationship between cities and atmosphere in this way opens up new modes of inquiry. Inquiry that will be crucial in formulating solutions to the coming climate crisis. In order to move forward, we must accurately diagnose the process of how humans come to be in the technical, social, empirical, and ontological spheres in which we exist. Thank you.